Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington. I'd like to welcome all of you to this briefing 7 years after Qadhafi's death. Is Libya any closer to democratic transition? It's a tough question and a detailed question, so we should be out of here by Monday, I think. We didn't tell you the time involvement or time schedule associated with this briefing.
We can just pretend.
Okay, yeah, that's right. A lot of developments have been happening. Libya is a complicated issue, and it's never boring. As a matter of fact, we have some development as we speak this morning, and we do have a couple of people participating who have been privy to recent visits to Libya and recent meetings taking place in Europe, particularly the last few days, who will brief us about that during the program. Let me just, by way of introduction, before I pass the podium to our moderator, my colleague, Imad Harb, Dr. Imad Harb, who's the Director of Research and Analysis here at the Center. Before I pass the podium to him, let me just mention a couple of things. I guess about 10 days ago today, October 23rd, marked the 7th anniversary of change that took place on the 23rd of October 2011 with the brutal kind of murder of Muammar Qadhafi and the change that took place after that in the country. And here we are 7 years after Qadhafi. Libya has evolved from one version of hell into another, unfortunately, and with very little kind of respite in between. In looking at my desk, you know, I had actually several reports, particularly from human rights organizations, whose work I really appreciate on the personal level and try to keep track of where things are in the Arab world. It's part of our mission as a center, and we try to keep track of it. I was arbitrarily, I just picked up for quotation purposes this morning, the one by Human Rights Watch on Libya. This is the summary of kind of last year's report, 2017. I just want to read the first paragraph of that report to kind of help us focus on the issue. The report says that political divisions and armed strife continued to plague Libya as two governments vied for legitimacy and control of the country. And United Nations efforts to unify the feuding parties flagged. The UN backs the Government of National Accord, the GNA, based in Tripoli in the west, but not the rival interim government based in the eastern cities of Al-Baida and Benghazi. Clashes between militias and forces loyal to these governments decimated the economy and public services, including the public health system, law enforcement, and the judiciary, and caused the internal displacement of over 200,000, if not more, Libyans. Armed groups throughout the country, some of them affiliated with one or the other of the competing political governments, executed persons extrajudicially, attacked civilians and civilian properties, abducted and disappeared people, and imposed sieges on civilians in the eastern cities of Derna and Benghazi. Of course, a lot of water has passed under the bridge since this report has been written and over the past 7 years, undoubtedly. For those of you who Googled things on Libya last night and today, you might be aware of the fact that another agreement has been reached last night, announced this morning between the parties. It makes it somewhat optimistic in a way, but at the same time, you have to be cautious, having seen so many agreements over the past 7 years that disappointed most of us, if not all of us. When you look back at the news this morning, that Libya's rival parliaments agreed today to work together to reform state institutions in an attempt to unify government authority in Libya. Libya, of course, like I said earlier, has two governments, the UN-backed government or administration in Tripoli and the rival one in the east, and with an ongoing kind of power struggle between the two of them. Of course, there is also the House of Representatives, consultative body, backed by lawmakers from previous assemblies. Both sides seem to have agreed in this new agreement to work together toward a unified presidential council, PC, made up of a president, two deputies, and a prime minister to end the division according to the legislators that announced the agreement, or the spokespeople. One of the lawmakers, Abdussalam Nusya, basically said that the project to reform the executive branch and unify state institution is a national project to end the division in the country. I hope his words will materialize, and that would signal a new phase of healing in Libya. But there are a lot of challenges involved in this agreement and in the surrounding circumstances in the country. So with that in mind, I wish you a good discussion today. And I would like to invite Imad to the podium to introduce our guest speakers today.
Well, thank you very much, Khalil. Thank you all for being here today on this very, very important topic in Arab relations and Libyan relations, to Libyan people's relations to each other, and for the Arab world, the Arab League, and actually also for the United States' interests in the Middle East. Today we're going to be talking about Libya. As Khalil mentioned, this is a country that has been going through some really very, very rough times since 2011. Basically, the Khayrat agreement of 2015 has really bogged down. The political agreement that was hammered out has bogged down. The Tripoli-based government or national accord that is supported by the United Nations is weak. It's actually dependent on a lot of militias to assist it in maintaining some control over the western part of the country, and not necessarily all the western part of the country anyway. In the east, we have a rival government that also has its own armed forces, its own central bank, and its own oil corporation. In the south, there are incursions of neighboring militias from Chad and Sudan, and there are gangs, militias all over the place. So this is a country that needs international intervention, needs local accommodation, local compromise between the different political forces. It also needs regional help and international assistance and compromise. The country is split between different rival factions domestically, but also there are a lot of regional influences on which I hope the gentleman will inform us a little bit. But I'm also ready to present some issues, some ideas about the regional influences, actually regional and international influences, if we consider Europe to be that far from Libya, which it is not actually. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to the speakers. First, we have Karim Mezran. He is their bios obviously is in that handout that you have. He's a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East, and he will be talking about the political aspects of the Libyan issue, but also he will also be touching on United States relations with Libya and what is at stake for the United States in Libya. And then we have Dr. Hani Shennib, who is the founding president and chairman of the board for the National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations. And he also will be talking a little bit about the political aspects of the crisis, but also will be touching on some very important considerations on the humanitarian front. So without further ado, please, Karim.
Thank you very much. Well, I see some old friends, people that know about Libya probably more, for sure more than I do. So my idea of giving a general view of the situation is changed. I would like to talk about, after giving a very short introduction to how is the situation, I would like to talk about the possible options to go ahead, and each one of them see how nuanced it is and how difficult it is to proceed, or if it might give us more hopes for a solution. Can you pass me the pen, please? Well, you know, the situation on the ground in Libya is very difficult, not only because of its complexity, but also because of the amount of rumors and fake news and counter rumors that go around, which make our work as analysts very, very hard, because it's very difficult to understand, to check the sources of things and understand what is really going on. And as Imad was saying before, it's very hard to clarify a situation on the ground that can allow us to judge if Palermo is going to work or not, or if Rome or the next one in Vienna or wherever it's going to be is going to work because of the contradictory comments. One thing is important to know, that despite all the appearances, because anybody who goes to Tripoli lately just sees the normal cities, he has the impression of calm, has the impression of traffic, everybody's out, everybody's around, the shops are working, things seem to be working, so it may give the impression that there is the calm and security. But this is only superficial. In reality, the population is very stressed. It's very stressed by the lack of services, it's very stressed by the lack of security, and worse than everything, I think that it's fundamental for us, for the question that we have to pose ourselves, where we want to bring Libya, what kind of Libya we want to have. Because it's obvious that every compromise, every process of peace, every negotiation has to have a goal. And this goal has been set in the revolution or the civil war of 2011 as a democratic Libya. But what that means, how to get there, sometimes it is forgotten. Sometimes in the options that are put on the ground by the UNSMIL or by this European mediator or that other actor, don't see an arrival point. A target that is fixed into, we have to bring the Libyan people to participate into politics. We have to make sure that the Libyans do not get detached from the process, that the Libyans do not get forgotten in all this talking about PC 923 and all the strategies that can be devised by people like us, sitting somewhere behind the desk and drawing these very nice academically sound projects, and then there is no way to bring the people into the picture. People that are getting dissatisfied, people that most of them are tired with the way the situation is evolving, and it's becoming very common now to hear among the population the voice that the golden age of Gaddafi, or what we need is a foreign invasion, or what we need is a strong man that gives order. There is no way that Libyans can be democratic. I hear that every day from many people and from many friends, and this is something that we have to fight. We have to really make sure that it is not forgotten that democracy or pluralism, if you don't want to use the word democracy, is a process. And if you look at the European countries that are democratic today, today and we look at their history, we see decades of pain, decades of terrorism, of attempted coups, of difficulties. But the successful ones are those who kept the direction. No matter what bumps you find in the street, no matter what defeats, no matter what difficulty, we have to remember and keep on reiterating that for the Libyans there is no way out except pluralism, inclusivity, transparency of the action, change the culture of the people slowly, and trying to make it in such a way that a society can be built, and a society that has the purpose very high and is capable of fighting for it. If we succumb in our plans, we start talking about getting rid of elections or allowing a strong man to take power, we will simply set the clock back to 20 or 30 years, and that has to be avoided. So the goal for the elites today, for the Libyan elites, is that to bring the people back, one way or the other. That's why there was a hint of excitement when the French or Salamé started talking about possible election in December of last year, if you remember. They started throwing this provocation, the idea of having elections. I thought that could have been a good idea because they could draw the people back into the game. Then, of course, you sit down, you start thinking, and your teachings come back, and what you have learned, and you know that there is no possibility of serious elections unless you have a stable country or a semi-stable country. The French got it wrong when they say that the elections are to be used in order to bring stability to a country. It doesn't work that way. So with a lot of attention, we moved back and we started thinking that probably the plan of Hassan Salamé, the first one, the one that he introduced in September, the idea of reducing the PC from 9 to 3 members, having a technocratic government, whatever technocratic might mean in the Libyan landscape, we have to decide. But a government that is detached from the political game and devotes all its time into the restructuring of the economy, providing services, leading the army, the constitution, the construction of the new security forces. That kind of government could run for a year and a half, bring some kind of stability, and then prepare the country for elections. Then we can discuss the details. Do you want to have a new constitution? Do you want to have? Do you want to simply insert the Libyan political agreement into the constitutional declaration and use that until you have elected an assembly? Because it is not true, as I said by most, that you cannot have elections without a constitution. Most of the times you do have an election without a constitution, and the assembly that is elected, the parliament, becomes the place where a new constitution is drafted, like in the Tunisian case or the Italians after the Second World War or many other countries. You just elect people that then draft a constitution and put the constitution to a referendum to be approved or not. So the fact that we don't have a constitution should not be seen as an impediment to proceed and to go on to move to elections or to move to something else. Those are stalling attempts, because also we have to remember another thing, that in Libya by now there is a whole class of people that are profiting from the status quo, from the situation. The corruption is very high, and there is a lot, and we have to say these things, even though they are not nice to be said. There's a lot of people who are trying to do all the best they can to stall any process, to move forward, by saying we have to have a constitution, or we have to have that thing approved, or an electoral law has to be passed, or why don't we remain in this situation indefinitely? Because that is the purpose of a good chunk of the elite. So what are the possible, just to make a long story short, I try to draft 3 or 4 possible scenarios or possible options or development, however you want to talk. The first one is the one I was talking about, which is much more of the same with improvements, which in my opinion can be the better thing. This new agreement, if it is real, if it is confirmed, it can constitute the basis of reforming a presidential council that has the functions of the president, formed by 3 people, that have only an oversight power. Then you can have the appointment of a government that is as inclusive as possible. And while the PC can be chosen according to regions, because there is this fixation that we have to have the East, the West, and the South, whatever that means. So you might have one representative, one of the 3 members from the South, one of the 3 members from the West, one of the 3 members from the East. The government should not be chosen according in that way. We have to make sure that the government is chosen according to competence as much as possible. I know that it's not an easy thing, but while we can use the regional approach for the PC, I think that it will be better for the Libyan to follow the competence for the government and insulate the government from the bitching of the political day and the personality and the various vetoes among the various groups. Then, if this agreement is real, it means that Haftar is going to be part of this construction, because otherwise there is no way that the HOR would have approved a compromise that doesn't include the exclusion of Article 8 of the LPA and a role for Haftar. So that has to be studied. How do we want to have Haftar within this improved situation? And the idea of a council of the army that sees him as primus inter pares, which is the leader figure, could be done if important figures from the other military parts are included in the agreement. As I said, there is no need for a new constitution at this point. The constitutional declaration and the LPC can do that. Let's not get stopped by the idea that you must have a constitution in order to proceed. You can do that very well. And option 2, it's possible that if nothing works in this agreement, we will simply continue with the way it is, with Serraj in power, dragging a situation which is slowly deteriorating, fixing the elections for March or April or May, and setting a first date there, and continue this way. In that case, there will be no reforms that could be applied, because probably there is not an agreement to enforce them later on. So there will be stalling in the attempt at reform to the economy, and the constitution will then become the excuse to postpone the elections further, and I call this option much more of the same without improvement, which is continue this way with the attempt to restructure the army by Fathi Bashaga, with the attempt of repairing part of the oil structure. I mean, moving in this parcel way. The option 3 is the military solution. Nothing works, we cannot go ahead. One party decides to enter more dramatically into the action. Whether the Egyptians decide to finally push Haftar into an attempt to move west, or somebody else comes in, or a foreign country decides to intervene militarily. These are all options that I don't believe are realizable, but we have to put them on the ground, because you never know. The way things are going, any option is really possible in this moment, I think. Not probable, but possible. Last but not least is the formal or de facto partition of the country, which is another thing that I don't see as highly probable, but it's a risk that the country really runs. It is more or less what is it today. I don't think that it will be ever formalized, because I don't see any international country ready to say, yes, we recognize the Libya divided in 2, in 3, in 4. But de facto, if the situation continues this way, we are going to have that situation, and that can lead to any possible other other scenario, one that sees a country recognizing the eastern part, a country recognizing the western part, and so on. And that would be a mess. So these are the four big options that I think we have. The Conference of Palermo could be a very important step if the plan, the way I understood it is the following: to have the Libyans come in with a roadmap design and agreed among them. This roadmap will be discussed the first day among the Libyans, will be presented the second day to the international community that would then sanction this roadmap. If this is, in my opinion, is the dream scenario. Because if this happens, we're going to have a roadmap designed by Libyans and guaranteed by the international community in all its entirety. Because all the guests who are there are going to say that, yes, we do agree on this roadmap. Therefore, the Egyptians, the Emirati, the Algerians, the French, the Italians, they all agree on this roadmap. And they all agree to use all their strength, their diplomatic, the economic capacity to help the Libyans to move forward on this roadmap. If that is the dream situation, I still have in my heart hope that is the way it will go. Because finally it means that there is a large agreement on how to proceed. Of course, they will not make the same mistake the French did in May to set the dates or time. It will be left to the Libyans with the help of the cadre of other countries to decide how to proceed, in what timetable and in what kind of agreement. There is a big role for the United States to play. I know that the Americans tend to resist the idea of intervening more directly into Libya. But I really believe that without the power of the United States behind and the leverage the United States have toward all the other actors, there will be no way to contain the interest of every state in its proxies in Libya to try to dominate to dominate the process. There has to be a strong American pressure so that every one of the international actors falls into place and decides to go behind this roadmap that has been designed and exercise all the influence that they have in Libya in order to make that workable.
Thank you very much.
There is much more to say, but we can do that at the question and answer. Thank you very much.
And I think Imad and Karim have summarized the status quo that we have today in a very, very proper manner. And I want to go to the last night's recommendations that were made by the HOR and the State Council, and emphasize a very important point. So Abdeslam Nusia, who together with his colleagues at the State Council made the decision last night, just a couple of weeks prior to the Palermo Agreement, is an indicator of what I sensed when I visited Libya about a couple of weeks ago. And that is that there is a sense in Libya, a sort of a national sense, that they are truly fed up of UN imposing recommendations and so on the Libyan people that in many ways reflect poor understanding of what is happening in the country, and also a sort of a resentment of a lack of control of the political process, which is a complication of the security process and so on that are not happening in Libya. And perhaps I will argue that if you look at Libya historically, and there were 3 provinces when it was identified as Cyrenaica, Tripoli, and Fezzan, with all the colonial interests right post the Turkish colonization. When the Italians came in 1911, they managed to do something very important, that they managed to create a sort of a sense of nationalism that for the first time identified Libyans together as one people. And it was that resistance to the Italians coming in 1911 and the 30-year brutal war that has happened with mass executions, resistance that went on and on and on, concentration camps where hundreds of thousands of people that have died, that have actually amalgamated the forces, the national forces, to a point where they said we have to take on our own fate. And seeing that the Palermo is, again, a byproduct of all these things that have happened in the 6-7 years, I'm not saying that it is not Libyan fault. Libyans are primarily responsible for their own fate, but it is perhaps that kind of nidus that was created all of a sudden by declaring a Palermo meeting 12th and 13th of November that intensified the sense by the Libyans that they had to do something which is their own and not something imposed by the outside. So the statement that was made yesterday is a reflection of all this. And I would argue that, and I have been following all those discussions between state and HOR, I would argue that in the last month or so, there have been tensions that were going on between the UN representatives and the Libyan representatives from those two councils, in that they sensed there were intentional or unintentional delays by the UN representatives in addressing the proposal that was made by those two bodies in trying to amalgamate the governance of Libya through the creation of a three-member sort of a council that would have representation from the three traditional provinces in it, and then just move on, remove the larger, inept council that exists today, and get on with the issue of dealing with day-to-day issues in Libya with good representation. So I want you to think about this as a sort of a precondition as to what is to be expected from the Palermo conference as it comes in there. This was a very strong statement made by the two representatives of the Libyan people, whether you like it or not. So that's the first point that I want to make. The second point that I want to make is that there is no way on earth that you can play a game in any form or shape without rules of that game. There may be constitutional or not constitutional, but you have to have some rules in there. And the ambiguity by which the last 6 or 7 years have been, the country has been run with no rules, changing rules and so on, is in part responsible for the chaos that exists. Is it something new in Libya? No, it isn't. It is a byproduct of 42 years of what Gaddafi has created in that country, which is organized chaos, or as I used to hear over there, it's a chaotic organization. So carry on. You've got 6 more years, the same structure that exists, the same formula that exists and so on, and it's not working. The third point that I want to make is the revolution that has happened, it didn't really happen because people hated Gaddafi. It is because people hated the way they lived under Gaddafi. And those conditions continue in the last 6 to 7 years. There is no change whatsoever. When Gaddafi came, and when Gaddafi died, and when you looked at those horrible images, it is a reflection of the end of a play, basically, of disorganization. The way he was killed is an epitome of exactly that. But we've actually ignored discussing why is this family dysfunctional? Why is Libya dysfunctional? If you go back to the days of Adrian Pelt, when he came in and tried to create a country out of 3 provinces, it was so clear at that time, through all the documents, in the library here, or if you go to State Department documentation and so on, of the ambassadors that were in Tripoli and Benghazi and so on, it was so clear that there was so much differences, historical differences between the 3 provinces, that you had to create a formula whereby you give the sense to those 3 provinces that they were going to be sharing power, that the future of Libya was going to be very considerate of those differences that existed between those 3 provinces. When Gaddafi came to power, he basically wiped up that whole equation. True in 1963 that there was a cancellation of the federation and creation of a new state, which is a unified state. But the truth is, it was still considerate of the anxiety and sort of concerns that existed historically between those three provinces. So in 1969, when Gaddafi came to power, there were two capitals in Libya. There was one in Benghazi and one in Tripoli. The crown corporations were distributed in a certain way, cognitive of those differences and so on. Gaddafi not only created a model of chaos, but he also transformed and moved all those crown corporations, canceled Benghazi as a capital, moved everything to Tripoli. And for 42 years, it was a model of disorganized, chaotic organization, and on top of it, an incredible centralized form of governance. When I visited Libya in 2003, after many, many years, 30-something years of, you can call it self-exile or so on, I walked into a situation whereby if you wanted to get a passport, if you wanted to get anything done, whether you come in from Fezzan or from El Beida or from Tobruk or so on, you had to travel to Tripoli to get that done. From 1969 to 1942, very, very little happened in the cities of the East. Now, you may look that there is progress and so on, but a lot of it was truly part of a 5-year plan that was done in 1969 before Gaddafi came to power. When I visited Benghazi for the first time after many, many years, I did not see Benghazi that I left in 1969, and many of us went to universities and so on. Farida went to a university over there in Benghazi. It was, has anybody visited Mogadishu? It was worse than that in the East. It was totally neglected. So when the change happened in 2011, it wasn't only about Gaddafi. It was about regaining power, recapturing some of the elements of a sense of a growing society in those cities in the East and South and so on that were neglected for 42 years. Ironically, is that even when people and the policymakers are looking at models of how do we fix Libya today, they recognize the differences, but it's like a dysfunctional family. They just put it on the side. They don't want to talk about the traditional 3 states and so on. They don't want to talk about the true undercurrent that is fueling this difference and so on. Why is it that there is a government in Tobruk and one in Tripoli? Why isn't it there's one in Tobruk and one in, let's say, Sirte or so on? Because it reflects those undercurrents of sense of the impact of centralization on Libya today. So, brings us back to what we are today and where we are. I don't know whether this newly created concept of a 3 individuals council will work or not. But I know one thing is for sure, that the same way of thinking, and I quote Albert Einstein on this, cannot be workable to solve the same sort of problem that we have today. We have to think something very different. And we have to engage the Libyans in it in a more serious way, not in the consultative form that Ghassan Salama is imposing and picking up what he likes and disregarding what they don't like and so on. Not through a colonial state that actually run Libya brutally for the last something years. It just does not make sense. Any Libyan will tell you the idea of having Italy be in charge of recommending what Libya is going to be like in the next thing is so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. And for us as Americans to accept the notion that a colonial power is given the file of Libya today is unbelievable. It is, in many ways, imagine that there's a conflict in Israel, and you're actually asking Germany to be at the helm of this group that want to solve an Israeli problem. It's unthinkable. So unless we start thinking out of the box, unless we start addressing the true difficulties that the Libyans have, And primarily, it is a lack of confidence. Nobody trusts. The East does not trust Tripoli. Tripoli does not trust the East. Now, you can color it Islamist, Haftar, and so on. Those are all kind of game players. In fact, what I sensed when I was in El Beida a few weeks ago is that people of the East, call them Cyrenaicans, do not trust Haftar, ironically. And everybody's fixated on the idea of a military, dictator coming in, all this stuff. It's got nothing to do with this. It's a sort of a symbiosis that they've created between the people in the East and Haftar, because they don't want to go back to that concept of a centralized government that is dictating upon them every little detail of how they want to run their lives. It's not about Haftar. In fact, Haftar, I would argue, is one reason that Cyrenaica has not seceded today, because he has his eye on Tripoli. He claims that he is the leader of the military of whole Libya. It isn't the case. It is a very unusual relation today. Now, I would argue, as we are talking about solutions and so on, that we have to identify the rule, because it is not just about signing an agreement, it's about the morning after. And that's where the international community has failed all the time. You could write the most beautiful agreement, but if you're not prepared the following day with your money, with your forces, with your experts, and so on, to do something tomorrow, you're not going to be able to solve anything at all. It's going to be exactly going back to the same chaos that the Libyans have gotten used to. So think about the morning after. Think about the rules of the game that you want to implement. You can call it constitution, you can call it agreement, you can call it a social contract, whatever you want to call it. And understand that it has, in many ways, very little to do with political processes or political thinking, Islam versus liberal. It's really all about protecting your daily life and assuring that you live in a country that is not going to go back to the marginalization of communities the way it has happened in the last 42 years. Now, the formulas that have been always put in there, they're resisted. Why are they resisted? They're resisted simply because they want to go back to the same idea of Tripoli is the area of power, and then we'll get municipalities. We'll distribute your money according to municipalities and so on. But they don't want to hear about regional growth, regional developments at a historical level, whereby you can guarantee that some of the revenue that is generated in those regions are truly going to deliver. They don't trust it. There's corruption, there's failure of central institutions, all these things in there. So I would argue that that's where you need to go back to the table and start drawing the rules of the game and think about the morning after. Thank you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for this well, it's sobering. It's extremely sobering to talk about the domestic issues of that Libyans are facing today, and what the difficulties are in the face of political compromises. But yet again, there also are other factors. Unfortunately, it's not only the Libyans that are, or the disagreements between Libyans that are making things more difficult. It's also the interference from outside actors, and there have been, unfortunately, civil wars call for this. Always civil wars when when factions in civil wars really seek the assistance from outside actors. That is when things become a little harder to really compromise on or fix. We have a lot of interferers in the Libyan matter. First of all, we have to talk about the Egyptian interference in. I mean, Egypt considers Libya to be a backyard kind of place where a lot of, first of all, a lot of Egyptians work in Libya. More than 1 million Egyptians work in Libya. It's vital that Egypt has a say in what happens in Libya, but yet at the same time, there is this political issue with political Islamists in Libya that Egypt is not really happy with and wants to do something about, supposedly. Together with Egypt, there is the United Arab Emirates that's helping in trying to supposedly stem the tide of the Islamist influence in the Libyan state or in, among Libyan factions. And both countries are assisting General Khalifa Haftar, the leader of the Libyan National Army, who is really, I mean, he has the gun, he has the military power to really make things a little difficult for any compromises if he doesn't really like those compromises. Besides Egypt, there obviously is the pressure from the surrounding countries. I mentioned earlier the issue with Chadian militias and Sudanese militias that are supposedly, these are the opposition forces of their respective governments, and they are operating in the south of the country. There are, the Algerians have a little say in what happens as well there. So do the Tunisians, but also there is an influence from Italy, from France, from Great Britain. I mean, everybody is trying to find. Yes, I know that it's very, very difficult for Libyans to really listen to all these voices and all. And Hani is correct about saying that how can you have a former colonizing power really decide for Libyans what they're supposed to be looking for, and that is true. But yet again, Italy, specifically Italy, is very concerned about Libya really being a conduit for a lot of migrants into Europe, and we also have to think that Italy's right-wing government under Conte is anti-immigrant, so they also have to. That they themselves consider themselves to be to have a great interest in trying to figure how things are in Libya and how they should be, because they consider that to be a national security issue for themselves. The United States, unfortunately, is not involved, although the United States has basically supported the United Nations efforts in the country. I think 2 days ago, Secretary Imad was asked about this. He said he doesn't really know what's going to happen in Libya. I mean, this tells you how much the United States government is really paying attention to Libya, although United States government has returned the American ambassador to Libya, Peter Bode, but we really are not sure where the Trump administration really stands on this. So we do have a lot of things to talk about regarding Libya's domestic and regional and international issues, and this will happen now in the Q&A session. First of all, there are some Q&A cards around on the table and on the ledge here. If you have a question, please write it on, and please write as legibly as possible so I can read the question. And but before we do that, we have our friend Bill Lawrence, who has participated in some meetings recently in Europe, and he knows a lot about this. And I want to give the floor to Bill to talk for about 2 or 3 minutes about the experiences that he's seen. Thank you.
So as Imad said, I just got back from 6 days, actually in Tunis, although I had previous meetings in Europe. And I had about 20 hours of Libyan meetings, including 3 hours with UNSMIL and 3 hours with the U.S. mission there, which is called LEO. So I have a lot of insights into kind of the inside baseball and how they're formulating their views. And then I had a lot of conversations with Libyan Thuar and other officials there, and also a lot of phone calls with people that are hard to reach sometimes. So we had a couple hours of phone calls too with people inside Libya to try to suss out some of the other viewpoints. The first thing I like to say is simply repeat that key point that Hani made at the beginning is so true. Everybody is really, really frustrated with the UN. They really, really feel like they've lost control of the situation. Nobody had a good word to say about Salameh. He will get no credit for this deal. By contrast, Stephanie Williams is held up as some kind of new messiah. I mean, I just was just amazed how glowingly people talk of her and how they feel that Stephanie can solve all her problems. And I said snidely at one point, Stephanie and what army, you know? But I mean, there's a lot of hope that Stephanie can do a lot of things, including bring the Americans in, which was a refrain of course, Karim's conclusion, but also every meeting I had there. Let me say that, first of all, and getting back to Hani's point about Italy, everyone's angry that the planning for the Palermo meeting came immediately the day after the Paris meeting, and that, but an extension of that, and I won't go into details, but the Paris-Rome competition over Libya is really angering people, and also helped lead to this agreement by default. But everyone wants the Americans to step in and ask Paris and Rome to step back. Meanwhile, there's about 4 NGOs, 2 Italian, 1 French, and 1 Swiss that are doing all these national dialogues, and there's a lot of resentment about the national dialogues. Militias are so angry that there was not only the recent dust up, but while I was there, the Mezrans are threatening to attack Tripoli within 2 weeks. They sent a missive. If Salameh doesn't clear out, excuse me, Sarraj doesn't clear all the corrupt militias out of the center of Tripoli. So there's a lot of talk of infisal, you know, and internal. But if there's competition among the 3 regions, there's much more competition right now within the 3 regions, which is why everyone I talk to is against the tripartite presidency, because why reify the 3 regions through a presidency where each region doesn't agree, right? So they would disagree on that personage. The way, I'll skip over all the horrible things that are going on a humanitarian service basis, but everything bad you hear is true. The way the UN is looking at things right now, it's sort of plan A, plan B, plan C. Plan A is a constitution or constitutional basis and then elections. And Salameh feels that has mostly failed and is probably going nowhere. Plan B is LPA amendments. The announcement yesterday is a version of LPA amendments. Prior to the announcement, Salameh felt it was going nowhere. A lot of people have not signed off on this agreement, including most of the armed groups in Libya. So that could fail. And Plan C is a national conference, which is mostly what Salameh is talking about. A national conference that would include 500 people. And the word from inside UNSMIL is he doesn't want names, he wants a mechanism for names. He wants help picking names. But my own feeling, if I can editorialize, is that a national conference as a fix-all is as foolish as a national as elections as a fix-all, because we're not dealing with the underlying issues. The solution is a version of 2. It's LPA amendments, and the Libyans know that, and which is why they came out with that announcement. I was dismayed how much the Americans and UNSMIL are focused on economics over politics. They really believe that you can fix Libya economically before politically. I was dismayed how much Stephanie's focused on the security arrangements in Tripoli, as if security can solve politics, and how few of the officials I spoke to were really focused on politics, which is the main game. And of course, all 3 security, politics, and economics have to move forward. But Salameh is so frustrated that the big speech he's apparently going to make on the 13th is apparently possibly going to include a bunch of new sanctions, because the UN feels that they sanctioned the sanctions have been really successful. They stopped the oil sales, et cetera. So now how we can have a bunch of sanctions? My response was, you can't stick without carrots. You can't stick Libyans into fixing their situation. You need incentives and political incentives to sort this out. So let me just conclude with something I've said before, that to my dismay, but also learning, the political crisis of 2013 in Tunisia was all about who and not what, because of the trust issue. And Libya right now is mostly about who and not what, who everyone trusts, right? And we don't have the who yet, and the what doesn't matter. And we've talked a lot about what today, but if we can't figure out in this political culture, in this context, who everyone trusts and who will lead the Libyans forward, then the content of the next day won't even matter. So that's what the game is right now. Who can Libyans all trust to lead the way out of this situation? And thank you for giving me a couple of minutes. I'm happy to answer questions on any of those things.
Thank you, Bill. We appreciate your contribution here. I have a couple of questions so far. Please do again write your questions on these cards, hand them out to the staff. This first question is from Francesco Santillo from the Embassy of Italy. He wants to assert that the meeting in Palermo for Libyans is with Libyans, and they themselves are the ones who are deciding what happens there. He has a question: how strong can the agreement be between the House of Representatives and the Higher State Council while the discussions is only on names? Any gentlemen?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, how strong can the agreement be between the SOC and HSC if the discussion is only on names?
Do you want to answer this?
It's what Bill just said. It's in this culture, in this situation, at the end, you can draft all the mechanisms you want, all the processes you want. In the end, they will fight against who is going where, who is representing what, who is going to sit in that chair. And that, I think, it's the way it is, Francesco. We cannot. I know Salamé is a great academician, and his idea was to design the process and the mechanisms, and then we talk about the people. I think that in Libya you have to either go together, or when you design a scheme, when you design a process, you have to have the names already ready or at hand. Because on that, everything will collapse. Because you can say we're going to have a presidential council of 3 people, one from the east. Who is going to represent the east? And they're going to fight over that. Who's going to represent the south? And they're going to fight over that. Who is going to represent the west? Because, and here I just grab 2 minutes, and I take advantage of your presence here, because I have one problem with the idea of tripartite Libya. I think it's much more fragmented than that. I think that today you cannot talk about Cyrenaica, Mezran, or Tripolitania anymore, because it is too fragmented. There is not even the widest possible common material in order to create the region and establish them. That is a constitutional colonialist construction, which I try to stay away, and that is, if you remember, and sorry for just this historical recollection, 2012, the GNC was supposed to be a constituent assembly. Then the separatists or the federalists in Cyrenaica put pressure over Abdel Jalil and said, no, we want to have 60 people deciding what 20 per region, and they fought about it. And Abdel Jalil changed the system, and up to 2 days earlier, when they said, okay, then this GNC is going to be elected, he's not dealing with the constitution no matter what. The people will elect another 60 to do that. So what you had created an assembly that was supposed to be a constituent assembly, that de facto, who turned out into a parliament that with no rules, no laws, no stuff, just to follow the diktat of the federalists. If you remember the time, we were quite strong and we were quite pushing the National Transitional Council to do exactly that. So the beginning of the failure, which is the GNC, was induced by this idea of giving equal representation to 3 regions that they were inevitably more fragmented than what is there.
I don't want to get into this whole thing. It's been going on for many years. But I just these are all the same arguments that the centralists have actually been proposing for the last 6 years, and it becomes a sort of more of a self-preservation of the status quo rather than trying to see if there are any potential for putting the country together in a federal model. So I'm not going to get into all this, but the way I see it right now, and I just came back from there, is if there isn't a sharing of power model that is created soon, that is cognitive of the regions, they're not going to accept that there will be a central government in Tripoli that will be able to deal with 18 little, governance or something like that. The mistrust is unbelievable, that it is unimaginable. And it reflects basically a lot of cultural things that a lot of people outside don't understand. I'll give you an example. You see, I was born in Tripoli. I lived in Benghazi. I'm a Cyrenaican. You're from Tripoli. Your father is Tripolitanian. Your mother is Italian. It's a very complex culture that we both come from. And my father and mother are cousins. It's very foreign to a lot of the people outside. But if you do not deepen inside Libya and understand those cultural differences, you're going to be exactly the same way. That's.
I want to follow up on this specific thing, because this is I think this is crucial for the questions, for the things we're talking about today. Is is it really only a power struggle between different elites, or is it really a legacy of the Qadhafi state? In other words, the absence of the state, the absence of the institutions. Has Libya only become a collection of personalities, or are state institutions there at all? Can you guys, can you gentlemen?
There are no state institutions. There are services that are provided in the most poor fashion. I mean, it's ironically, it's just like filter paper. The central part gets the strongest color, and as you go further away, it fades away. I visited Tripoli, I visited Benghazi, I visited Al-Bayda, and these are sort of getting more and more peripheral. And then you go to a city like Derna, which used to be the cultural mecca of Libya. What does it produce right now? It produces ISIS fighters. It is the highest concentration as a percentage of any ISIS wars that are happening in the world are coming in from the city of Derna. Now, if you talk about U.S. national interest, that becomes the essence of U.S. national interest in there. If we are fighting against ISIS, we've got to go down to the root causes of all these things and try and address them. Why is it that a city like Derna in 1969 was a resort city? You'd go there to enjoy the Derna Falls, the communities that exist together. There was a time in Derna where there were 3 languages that were taught in Derna. You'd learn Arabic, Hebrew, and Turkish. This is in 1911. The whole community over 50 years, and then thereafter, in the 42 years of Gaddafi rule, is decimated completely. And what do you produce because they are marginalized by Gaddafi and his central form of governance? Radicalism. So how are you going to sort all these things? You've got to go down to the root of the cause and try and address it. The central model of governance in Libya is not working. I walked into hospitals as a physician, as a surgeon. I went to Benghazi. The name of the game is unbelievable, but is not understood. In 2012, I negotiated an agreement with a group of American doctors, surgeons, to go to Benghazi and start a pediatric heart program. It was successful. In Tripoli, there were 4 pediatric heart surgery programs in there. 1 private and 3 in different places. So there was a need in the East. You could tell that there was a need in the East. We started this whole program. Well, guess what happened? In the process from 2014 until 2016, 17, and 18, the Siraj government to punish the East, to punish Benghazi, to bring them to their knees, because that is the model that is run in the Arab world. You got to bring your enemies to their knees. So what did he do? He cut the expenses for that thing. He punished them by not paying for this program. So what does he do? He sends somebody to negotiate with the group here to transfer the program from Benghazi to Tripoli. So the program has been transferred to Tripoli. There's no pediatric heart surgery program in there. Kids are dying. The families are angry. When I walk into all this, I walk into this situation. That's Benghazi. You go to Derna, you do not want to walk into a hospital in Derna. It's a total disaster. You wouldn't put your dog in there. You wouldn't put your pet in a place like this. It's foul-smelling, broken beds, total neglect, and nobody cares about it. So when you talk about governance and you talk about institutions and whether this is going to succeed or not, it goes back to the root causes of all these things. And you're not going to be able to do this from a central government. I don't care what it is like. So.
Thank you.
No, I agree with this. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not advocating a central government. I'm advocating a decentralization that is wider, which you don't like anyway. We go through municipalities rather than having 3 regions that you think there are. But this is. Yeah.
2 questions from Ken Meyercord. One for Karim, which is those people who were in control of $60 billion in Libya's sovereign wealth fund. Are they interested in maintaining that control? Is that a factor in the chaos in Libya? And to Dr. Shennib, Libyans have they don't have anymore, the standard of living during Qadhafi's time. But well, no. Does that mean that they still enjoy the highest standard of living in Africa?
Sorry, can you say it again?
No. Libyans used to have a higher standard of living during Qadhafi's time. Is that still the case regarding Africa?
No, I mean, I think Libyans enjoyed an amazing quality of life in 1969 under the kingdom, where the currency was, the Libyan pound was equal to the UK pound, and it was 3.3 US dollars for a Libyan pound at that time. And I think that what you see is, I mean, even Gaddafi was a dictator, and he just did not understand the world economy properly, but he actually micromanaged everything in there. When I walked into the office of the prime ministers in the days of Gaddafi, whether it is Ghanem or it is Mahmoudi and so on, one of the most difficult things that they had to deal with is to try and do things behind Gaddafi, because he was micromanaging everything and he wouldn't let anything go by. The sad part about all this is that, and I've heard this, I heard it from you, is that everybody had dreams that after Gaddafi would have gone, that everything would just nourish and be great and so on. But if you think about it a little bit, and what has happened in Libya, in October 23rd, 2011, it gives you an impression of how the world sees Libya. The ambassador, the UK ambassador to Libya, 23rd of October, submitted his resignation, went back to UK, established a company, his own company, and then negotiated with 6 other corporations that were interested in Libya to be their agent there. And within 1 week, he was strolling the corridors of the central government that is running in Tripoli, negotiating and making sure that new contracts and so on either would continue or new contracts would be negotiated. That's the way the world reacted to what happened in Libya. That is the sad part about Libya today, and it's no different. They do not see people. You know, you'll have 6 million people, you go through them, and you see what is my own interest in that part of the world.
To Karim, the question again is, might the vested interest of those who control the $60 billion Libyan sovereign wealth fund to retain that control be a factor in the ongoing chaos in Libya?
Well, corruption is very high, and I have no faith in the fact that there is people who are so generously altruistic and they are going to give up their position of power. So I think that whoever is in control, yes, they will do all they can to keep control of not only the 60 billion of the Libyan Investment Authority, but also the money in the central bank, also
This question is for Karim from Greg Aftedinian, our non-resident analyst. How can the political forces in the country disarm the militias, given the fact that some of these militias are tied to the political forces?
This is the most difficult question. And this is where, and I had a chance to reiterate it at the Pentagon very recently, it is the focus of all the problems, because you can even think about a possible political solution, a possible economic solution, but to disarm these militias that has been allowed to entrench themselves and to now represent the economic interest and determine whatever happens in certain parts of the territory is going to be the most complicated thing. And not only the militias, but let's think about the criminal organizations. That's something that we always tend to overlook, but they are by far more powerful than the same militias, because they have the cash, they have the control of the territory, and they are a lot of time the same thing or complacent with the militias. So it will be an effort that has to be done at the highest level and all together. You have to have a government that is capable of obtaining the faith and the trust of the citizenship. You have to have local institutions that are helped and supported in fighting this problem. You have to have the economy that can provide an alternative for jobs for part of these militias. Because also you have to understand, we have to be realistic. A lot of these kids who are members of the militias, they haven't gone to school in the last 6-7 years. Or their brothers were unemployed and were probably in Algeria. They call them Hittists. People sit in the wall smoking and without having any food and nothing to do. Now you give them a Kalashnikov or an AK-47 and they command. They get respect, they get money, they get a purpose in life. How to convince them that is phased, that has to change, that he has to return to a civil life, that there has to be respect of the law and stuff. That will be a long-term investment. So you have to have a short-term strategy that tries to play with them, turning them into local militia, turning them into local policemen. I don't know. The National Guard didn't pass. But some form of that in order to keep them as much as possible under control, while if everything goes well and there is an economy, most of them are ready to go back to school or are ready to work in the civil sector, and it is a slow process of stuff.
Do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, it is a very difficult question, but it has to be answered. I mean, we can't answer it in a room here in Washington, D.C. I mean, just think about all those emotions and feuds and so on that exist in there. I think the situation is easier in the East, not because it is an organized army. It is because it managed to amalgamate an odd group of militias and create an army under one military force, which is Haftar and his colonels. If you walk into in the East today, you'll understand that there's only one ruler, and that if there are any problems, you go to that ruler, and he will send his forces, and he will take care of it. I mean, have we changed anything from Gaddafi to now? We haven't changed anything. We created another thing. All right, but since you're talking about security, it is security in relative ways. When the Benina or Benghazi airport was not working and there were some bribes giving and so on, the local police couldn't sort it out, because the local police is a tribal police, and everybody has a cousin, everybody kind of talks to this and that, and they participate in the process of corruption. So who sorted that problem? You know, the army came in, they were a show of force, there were 200 people that went into the airport, and they nodded their sticks, and they did this and so on, and all of a sudden, it was discipline again. Am I for something like this? Of course, we all dream of a democratic country and so on. But in a nation where there have been taught that that's the way you do things for the last 50 years, it's going to be a process of an evolutionary process rather than a prompt thing. Now, it's more complicated in cities like Tripoli, and I totally agree that there has to be a creation of a force in there, even perhaps with assistance from internationals, experts, forces, whatever you want to call it. Now, the same conversation I had with Ghassan Salama, and I asked him up front, I said, Ghassan, the issues of security and so on are much deeper than the capability of UN Support Office. Have you thought, have you considered a proposal of sort of a semi-formula where you transition your UN Support Office to a sort of a more of an intervention office that would allow a little bit of margin to intervene in certain areas and so on? His answer was, and being a bureaucrat in the United Nations, you know, you kind of navigate through the least paths of resistance. He said, there is absolutely no appetite, there's no money, no support for the idea of bringing it, nudging up a little bit to a sort of an intervention office, even if it is a little bit of a role in there. The issue in the South is much more complex, but you know, ironically, if there is an international will to secure borders, to have a presence of blue berets and so on in the South, then I think all those criminals that are living on, you know, drug and money transfer and all these things will take attention and will at least, you may not be able to suppress it completely, but you may be able to downgrade it a little bit. So those are things. By the way, I just want to mention to all that are here is that we have a conference that will be held November 13th, if you permit me to say that. And it is going to be addressing all those aspects of the policy, security, and economy in Libya. It's a full-day program at the Rayburn Building on November 13th, because I know this is only an hour and a half, but this will be a full detailed with 26 expert speakers and so on, and I invite you all to participate at that conference.
Thank you. Question from Mohammed Shenawi from Voice of America. What could make or break the Palermo International Conference on Libya, especially after the latest agreement to unify the state institutions? Question is for Dr. Hani, but also Dr. Karim can also answer.
So always, Libya is great in intentions, very little in delivery. There is nothing in the curriculum of any school or university or so on that takes a person and teaches them methodology, how to do things and so on. I'll just make I'll make a committee tomorrow. Now, whether that committee is going to do anything, God knows. So again, it goes back to the second point that I made, which is the morning after. Great. We're got a now at the council. All right, congratulations. How are you going to work? Where are you going to work? Where's your seat? How are you going to deal with all the militias and so on that are around? How are you going to appease them? Because the whole process of politics in Libya has been about appeasement. You create a committee, it's about appeasement. Get somebody from this village, get somebody from here, and so on. So their capacity is not there. And the answer to your question is, you can't just do it from above downwards. You've got to create that kind of solution which engages the base and bring it all the way up to it. The council will only appease one thing. It will solve the issue of resentment towards the existing council. I mean, it's just like, you know, we got to get rid of this. But it does not bring new solutions.
I agree. I agree. This is the problem, is the capacity to act, the capacity to receive and deliver. At the same time, what you are saying, which is the correct answer, it's a medium to long-term position. If you have to act rapidly and begin that process of re-education, you have to start somewhere, and that somewhere you have to start with what you have. You have these people at the United Nations. This is what they are. You have this lack of appetite in the international community to intervene. You have the hope that if you resolve the polarization, in a sense, the difference between East and West, and they can collaborate together. I know that it's a long stretch, but in the end, it's all we have to resolve the situation, or to begin to reverse the negative trend in which Libya has fallen in the last 6-7 years. You have to begin somewhere and slowly start creating the premises for what you say, that is creating a local level that is receptive to the dynamics of dialogue, of pluralism, or acceptance of capacity building, and creation of institutions. Obviously, you can start, if you have a very well-functioning municipality, the same people that work there can be elected to work in the parliament and national, and they can bring the experience, the positive experience they had at the local level, they can build it up at the parliament, and then you can create a bureaucracy. And this takes time, takes a lot of time. That's why, at the same time, as I wrote in a recent article, I said we should forget the law of political isolation, and we should try to recuperate as much as possible from the bureaucracies of the previous regimes. People that had at least an idea of how a ministry works, of how a state works, and try to utilize them in the administration temporarily until you have a class that is formed. And this is a step that takes a long time. But you have to start somewhere. If we start saying that's not going to work, where is the first step?
Thank you. Next question is from Muhammad Awais. It's for any of you, actually both of you, if you'd like. Why didn't you mention really what the Libyan people really want? Imposing a solution from the outside will not work. So what are Libyans saying they want?
I could tell you 1 or 2 points of view that may not reflect anything. The basic answer is Libyans are fed up. There's an incredible amount of burnout. They're just tired of different models, different exercises, different councils, different governments, and so on. And they want the basic human security that every human being anywhere else in the world aspires to. So that's the general coding of a way of navigating around your answer. From a governance point of view, I deal with 3 opinions. One is a sort of more of a centralist opinion of governance. The second is a federalist model of governance. And the third goes to the extreme of cessation. If the current poor conditions are allowed to continue, you threaten that